Um, Welcome to the next session. My name is Anthony Froggatt. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House. I'm delighted to be welcoming the Right Honourable Claire Coutinho, who is Secretary of State for Energy and Energy Security and Net Zero. We have a half an hour, so we have to keep this quite tight, so I'm not going to make any introductory remarks other than to say it is on the record. Please do tweet out on #CHEnergy. The Secretary of State will give a speech for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for a small number of questions. So, Secretary of State, please take the floor.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. As Secretary of State for Energy Security, it's my job to make sure that here in Britain we can keep the lights on. Putin's invasion of Ukraine sparked the most severe threat to European energy security since the 1970s, but British energy supplies held up. Not only did we keep the lights on at home, but we also pumped fuel to our allies in Europe as they weaned themselves off Russian gas. The UK banned Russian fossil fuels, making sure we were no longer contributing to Kremlin coffers. We've led the world in driving Putin out of our energy markets once and for all, and I continue to encourage allies around the world to do the same. But most importantly, we must never find ourselves in that position again. From my time in this role, it's clear that we've entered a new era, an era in which energy can be weaponized against us, an era where our adversaries can inflict harm on British families and businesses through energy prices. If we can't protect families and businesses from the threat of future shocks, then we're not really secure. So we must be hard-headed and realistic about the future of our energy system. We must put national interest over narrow ideology and give time for the country to make the transition. And more than anything, we must take the necessary steps to protect British families and businesses by keeping energy bills down. Because our country will only succeed in the decades ahead if we can source enough cheap and secure energy to power our nation. The people at the forefront of my mind when I do this job are the people at home who are worried about turning on their heating. It's the small businesses who are worried about whether they can pay their staff. If people can't afford the gas in their home, or the fuel in their car, or their electricity bill, then even if we have enough supply, we're not really secure. That's why, in the last 2 years, this government has taken unprecedented steps to support people through the energy crisis. We spent over £100 billion protecting the economy and households across the country. The average household received £1,500 of support, halving their energy bill when the crisis was at its worst. We've given even more support to the most vulnerable households with our winter fuel payments, cost of living payments, and our home insulation programme. We've eliminated the premium on prepayment meters. We're working with Ofgem to look at the fairness of standing charges. Our pump watch scheme is making sure drivers will get a fairer price at the pump. And we're reforming the retail energy market to allow customers to benefit from the cheapest prices of the day, which could save them up to £900 a year. But no one can deny how hard the last few years have been. Whether it's a business being unable to expand or the tough choices that families have had to make at home, there's been a very human cost to the extreme prices that we've faced. But thankfully, we are turning a corner. From April, families will be paying their lowest prices for energy since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, with the average household bill set to fall by almost £250. But there's more to do if we want to make sure Britain's energy is secure, reliable, and crucially cheap for decades to come. If we look back over the last 300 years, Britain has boomed because of our access to homegrown energy. The Industrial Revolution was fueled by British coal. Since the 1960s, we've had North Sea oil and gas. And now our windswept shorelines are increasingly powering Britain from Britain. But make no mistake, we are in a global race for energy. The growth in demand from emerging economies is soaring. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there are 600 people who have no access to electricity at all. That will change in the decades ahead, and rightly so. In Asia, the construction of renewables and demand for fossil fuels is breaking new records every year. When it comes to energy and its supply chains, we need to be very realistic about each source's strengths and its weaknesses. The West cannot wean itself of Russian oil and gas, only to then be dependent on China for its critical minerals. But Britain's history, our expertise in energy, our geology, our infrastructure, our skills mean that we have a competitive advantage, but we must not throw that away. That's why we are doubling down on our offshore wind sector, which will provide us with cheap, clean, homegrown energy, replacing oil and gas as our North Sea reserves naturally decline. Our world-renowned contracts for difference auctions, introduced in 2014, weave together the conservative principles of competition and enterprise to drive down costs for consumers. And we now have the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth largest operational wind farms anywhere in the world. And we'll go further thanks to our new auction round with the largest ever pot for renewables. But we also know that we'll need a stable baseload beneath it, and that's why I've announced the largest expansion to our nuclear program in 70 years. Whether it's large power plants, small modular reactors, or the next generation of advanced modular reactors, we are building it. And we're being realistic about our need for oil and gas too. The Energy System Operator and even the Climate Change Committee acknowledge that in a net zero world, we'll still need oil and gas for a significant amount of our energy. And that's because it's not net zero, it's not absolute zero, it's net zero. And the Conservatives are the only party to consistently back our North Sea oil and gas sector. That's because we need oil and gas not just for our energy supply, but for the energy transition too. I'm afraid the Labour policy to turn off the taps too soon is disastrous for our energy security, for investment into clean energy, and for 200,000 British jobs in the sector. As any reasonable person knows, transitions take time. Labour's approach would leave a generation of oil and gas workers stranded before the next generation of jobs are created, but this government will never do that. That's why we need to be honest and pragmatic about what else our new energy system will need. A weather-dependent, renewables-based electricity grid means we will need to have flexible power for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, which is why we need to make the most of the main flexible power that we have today, gas. There are no two ways without it. Without gas backing up renewables, we face the genuine prospect of blackouts. Other countries in recent years have been so threatened by supply constraints that they were forced to go back to coal. There are no easy solutions in energy, only trade-offs. If countries are forced to choose between net zero and keeping citizens safe and warm, believe me, they'll choose to keep the lights on. We will not let ourselves be put in that position. And so as we continue to move towards clean energy, we must also be realistic. A renewables-based energy system needs backing up with power plants which we can ramp up and ramp down when it isn't windy or sunny enough. We are working hard to get new, cleaner technologies scaled up to deliver this flexible power. That might be putting carbon capture technology on gas power plants or scaling up entirely new technologies like hydrogen gas-fired power when they are ready. We're doing everything we can to propel new, innovative designs to market, but we also acknowledge that we will need some tried and tested capacity until these kick in. For this brief window of time, that leaves us with unabated gas. Anybody who tells you that we can just stop oil and gas is not wrong, but not just wrong, but naive. Imagine if we told people that we're going to shut down all petrol stations today because we think electric cars will be the norm in 2050. People would rightly tell us that we were insane. Their instincts would tell them that we cannot affect that kind of change overnight. And that's true of our energy system too. Even the Climate Change Committee's independent data finds that a power sector without unabated gas in 2035 would be, and I quote, likely to increase costs and delivery risks. And the Energy System Operator's analysis suggests that a net zero power system will be achievable by 2035, but only with fossil fuels in reserve. We know that with around 15 gigawatts of gas due to come off the system in the coming years, we will need a minimum of 5 gigawatts of new power to remain secure. That might mean refurbishing existing power stations, but will also mean new unabated gas power stations until the clean technology is ready. So I say this to all our electricity generators here in the UK. Renewables will play an ever more critical role in powering Britain, but I will not risk our energy security by refusing to address the difficult short-term choices we need to make. This government will stand with you as you invest in building more gas power stations, and if investors are serious about reaching net zero without damaging the economy or hiking bills for families, then they should stand with you too. There are 2 reasons why backing gas is not at odds with our world-leading net zero commitments. First, we expect all new gas power stations to be built net zero ready. That means companies must build power plants which are ready to connect to carbon capture technology, or that can be changed to burn hydrogen instead of gas. This is not just a government expectation, it's a common sense for investors too, because they know that this government is serious about reaching net zero. But our position remains. We must build these new power stations to ensure security of supply while the low-carbon technology develops. And I fully believe that this country can be a global leader in CCUS. We have the right geology, the right infrastructure, and the right skills to be a world leader in carbon capture. That's why the government is making a massive £20 billion commitment to this game-changing technology, and why I'm focusing on how to create a competitive CCUS market by 2035. Second, these gas power plants will run less frequently as unabated as we build more and more low-carbon generation and long-term storage. But while we're bringing other flexible sources online, we won't take any risks. In the past 6 months, we've been accused of rolling back on our net zero plans. So let me tackle this head on. Britain is the poster child for net zero. We've halved our greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Out of the top 20 largest economies in the world, nobody has done more than us. To give you an idea, the EU has cut emissions by only 30%, the US not at all, and China's emissions are up by 300%. And we've done that all whilst growing the economy and avoiding the riots and protests that we've seen abroad. And this last point is critical. There is no point in being world leading in cutting emissions if your businesses end up moving abroad and your people are suffering from high energy costs. Frankly, there's no point in being world leading at net zero if nobody wants to follow your lead. That's why we're putting investment first. Since 2010, we've seen £300 billion invested into green technology, creating jobs up and down the country. And in my past 6 months, I've delivered £30 billion of business investment into our energy revolution, thanks to the negotiations and policies that we've put in place. And this is key. Global investors are choosing to back Britain. Britain's story is one of endless innovation. We are perfectly placed to develop the technology and expertise to help developing nations with their own transitions. We have to be honest that this will be our biggest contribution to global climate change, more so than what happens with our own domestic emissions. Innovation, expertise, and exports. That's what the big energy economies like the US, Canada, Norway, and Saudi Arabia are doing. And I'll make sure that whether it's fusion energy, hydrogen, or carbon capture, we will both meet our net zero targets and that Britain will reap the reward for it. But we won't reap those rewards if we're not realistic about the time it will take to decarbonise our electricity grid. Our target to decarbonise the grid by 2035 has been set to allow time for a first-of-a-kind technology to evolve and for British supply chains to bloom. In stark contrast, Labour's plan for a decarbonised grid by 2030 in just 6 years' time is not a rational position. It's not something that businesses ask me for. It's not something that consumers ask me for. It would not leave time for British supply chains to develop, and it would signal to the rest of the world that we would have to pay whatever it takes to meet the cost of a target that is based on fantasy and which no other major economy is aiming for. What would be the risks? At worst, Labour's policy would plunge us into blackouts. At best, the costs of our energy system would skyrocket. We'd be left importing key components for our energy system from the current dominant global players. So let me be clear. Whether that's minerals or batteries or cables, Keir Starmer's policy is for a made-in-China energy transition, but I want one that is made in Britain. That's made in Teesside, in Cornwall, and Aberdeen, and everywhere in between. And that's why just last week, the Chancellor announced that Giga just got bigger. Our Green Industry Growth Accelerator now totals over £1 billion and will grow the supply chains for all the clean technologies that we need for the future. We're doing everything that we can to help our future technologies develop with multi-billion-pound programs and capital allowances for clean investments in carbon capture, hydrogen, fusion energy, and offshore wind. However, anybody sensible will tell you that these things take time. To pretend that you can do things overnight is a fundamentally dishonest position. To pretend that policies that you once said would require £28 billion of borrowing can now happen at the same pace but without the price tag is a fundamentally dishonest position. But the British people are not stupid. This debate is too important for the future of our country for politicians to be dishonest with the public about the choices that we have to make. People should not have policies imposed on them which are not in their interests, and that will never be this government's approach. Everything that we do in energy must work to keep the cost of energy down whilst keeping the lights on. Yes, that means not taking chances with our energy system by ensuring it has everything it needs to remain resilient. And it means allowing the market to bring forward those next generation technologies that will strengthen our energy system and turn a profit for Britain so we can grow our economy. But it also means making sure our energy market prioritises the bill payer. Bills are most people's only experience of the energy system. It's through cost that people will judge our success, and that's why we're leaving no stone unturned to cut bills. This is what we must remember as we today launch the next step of our review of electricity market arrangements, or REMA. This is the biggest electricity market reform in a generation. It will mean cheaper bills, massive investment, energy security for decades, and cleaner energy as well. In this next round of consultation, we've kept zonal pricing on the table to explore it more thoroughly. This is a potential supply-side reform which would encourage companies to build infrastructure closer to where energy is needed. It would mean our energy system would be smaller and more efficient, and less energy infrastructure would be needed overall, leading to lower costs for consumers. We've already seen it successfully used in other renewable energy powerhouses like Norway and Denmark. Alongside other options that we are considering, it could mean £35 billion in savings over 20 years. That's a saving of up to £45 every year for each household. But let's be clear, every household, whether they are in Glasgow, Grimsby or Guildford, would benefit from market reform. This ambition, cutting bills for everyone, is exactly why we're keeping zonal pricing on the table. And that's why we're working hard to grasp the opportunities of renewables for consumers. With a smarter energy system, we can shave up to 11% off peak demand. It sounds technical, but that's a £50 billion opportunity for bill payers over the next 25 years. An electric car driver on the right tariff could charge overnight when electricity is cheapest, meaning that while they used to pay 70p per mile using petrol, they now pay 2p per mile. The same would apply to household energy bills. Our work on smart energy tariffs based on the cheapest price of energy in the day could save households up to £900 a year. There is huge potential here for us to cut the cost of living. We should give families the choice to use cheaper energy when it suits them. We'll use our conservative principles of competition, choice and efficiency to give families the best chance of cheaper energy. And this will cut costs for businesses too. So as we contemplate the challenges ahead, our strategy will follow common sense principles, principles that reflect the reality that energy security is not just about having plentiful supplies, but affordable energy too. That Britain, with our history of energy expertise, is well placed to reap the rewards of creating the new energy technologies of the future if we manage that transition well. A hard-headed and realistic approach about our future energy system, prioritising the national interest over narrow ideology, and taking the necessary steps to cut costs for families and businesses. That's the approach I've outlined to you today, and that's the way Britain will continue to lead the world towards a cleaner, cheaper, and more secure future. Thank you.
So thank you. Time for a few questions. I said before, we agreed beforehand I'd do it in 2 rounds, one from the press and then open it up to everyone else, and I hope that we can get through those in 7 minutes. So maybe Tom Clark from Sky and Jonathan Leakey from The Telegraph. That's okay.
Thank you very much. I think speaking to people in the energy sector, their biggest complaint about getting us to a low carbon energy system is the constant playing of politics around energy. And that's the biggest obstacle to getting there. What would you say to that in a day we've heard headlines about blackouts and not gambling with our energy future?
Well, this is the entire point that I'm trying to make. We need to be able to have honest debates about what kind of energy system we need and what that requires, which is why we've set out this position on gas, which is why we are, I think, the only party to talk about the importance of oil and gas in our system overall, and how much the people who invest in oil and gas are also investing in the new technologies of the future. So I would say our position is based on evidence, it's based on fact. It comes from the fact that I talk to hundreds of people from industry and investors. I do think there is an important point here, which I'm trying to make, which is that the 2030 decarbonisation of the grid policy, that is pure politics. That does not come from fact. It does not come from industry. It does not come from consumers. And that is not the way that we can create policy when it comes to our energy.
Thank you. Who's that? Oh, sorry. Looking around. Go. Here.
Hi there. Yeah, Jonathan Leake. I'm the energy editor at The Telegraph. Just quickly, so you talk about an end to unabated gas, and I can follow all the arguments, but roughly when might we see an end to unabated gas? I know you can't be exact, but approximately when? And then just on zonal pricing, as I understand it, you're going to seek to attract generators to build, say, solar farms or wind farms near to cities and towns, and they'll be able to charge more for the power they generate. You talked about there being a saving of £45 a year, which I think it relates to getting rid of constraint payments or reducing them. But if those generators are charging more for the power they generate around cities and towns, surely that's going to add to bills. So I wonder whether you can just explain whether there will not be, as well as a reduction of £45 per year, an increase because of the extra costs of generating around in those areas, and what the net balance you think might eventually be. Will there really be a saving for consumers, and can you predict that far ahead anyway?
So firstly, in terms of savings for consumers, we're consulting on zonal pricing, but the whole point of it is that you need less energy infrastructure overall. So you've got a smaller and more efficient grid, which is why you get savings. And we've published analysis alongside our announcement today, which shows that every part of the country should get some savings. But, you know, as you rightly say, there's questions to explore, which is why we're consulting on that policy. But I personally think that when you're presented with a policy that can lower bills for families around the country, we have a moral duty to explore that thoroughly. And on your first question, remind me because you did two, very naughty. Right. So On that, what you need is a flexible capacity, so then when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, you've got something underneath that can ramp up when you've got demand. Now, at the moment, there's different forms of long duration storage that we are exploring. So you could have abated gas through CCUS, you could have hydrogen. We are consulting on other types of long duration storage as well. But a lot of the stuff is first of a kind technology, right? So you don't know exactly when you will definitely have enough, which is why we want to have unabated gas and the amount of new unabated gas online, so we've got that as an insurance policy. In terms of those other forms, you can see how much we're backing these new technologies. I did a hydrogen investor forum last week where 350 people came, and actually I don't think anyone in the world is doing more than us when it comes to hydrogen. In carbon capture, another form of how you might proceed with abatement, we set out £20 billion to make sure that we can move this technology forward. And I would say this is something which is really important for us in terms of our competitive advantages. So we are quite literally throwing the kitchen sink at making sure we've got these different types of flexible capacity. But until that time that's online, we need to have gas as a backup.
I'll take two questions. Two people caught my eye. There was a lady there in the red and white jacket, and there's a gentleman there at the back. And then if we could do thank you very much. And then we'll try and do another, come back to the journalists as well.
Thank you very much.
Please keep them very short.
Sure. I'm Sheila. I'm from Botswana, but I'm also a senior associate fellow here at Chatham House. I ask my question as a citizen of Africa. I'm mindful that the British government is contemplating partnerships in the critical raw material space. And my question, therefore, is one, what is your distinct value proposition to African governments wanting to do business with you in the mineral space? And how does that value proposition differ from that which the British government has offered those countries in the last century?
Thank you. And then the gentleman there, if you just raise your hand. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Claire, just to pick up on
Please
Tom's
introduce
point.
yourself, sorry.
Sorry, my name's Josh Dugdale from the Urge Collective. Just to pick up on Tom's point about playing party politics, the previous panel was concerned in quite a big way as to the message being sent to consumers and investors. And consistency is so important. And I just wonder, in your quest to become a model for other countries, whether you couldn't sit down with your shadow counterparts and come up with a strategy together, because it's such an important issue, which would send a really positive message to investors and consumers with a view to being able to put their money and their choices in the right places going forward, as opposed to what's happened over the last years of people really not knowing what the government strategy is, or the policy is, or what the messaging is.
Okay, so on that, I would say there's very few countries who've set out as much detail as we have when it comes to the transition to net zero. Very, very few. We've set out in much, much greater detail than almost every single one of our counterparts, which is why we are the first country in the G20 to halve emissions, and we've got the most ambitious targets going forward. So I would say actually we've got a lot of clarity compared to other people. In terms of politics, I would argue that actually one of the most important things in making sure that people around the world can see what's happening in the transition and want to do their own is that we can do this in a way which is fair to households and businesses. And we've seen in continental Europe, if you get that wrong, the riots and the protests that have happened there, I don't think are a great advert for success. Whereas here, we've grown the economy, we've still got broad consensus, but we do need to make sure as we're talking about these decisions, A, we're being honest about the choices that we face, and B, that we are putting consumers and the needs of businesses in this country first. Because if we don't make our transition to net zero look good and a positive experience, then other people will not want to do it, and that's not the ball game. In terms of your conversation, critical minerals are so important. So we've got a critical minerals strategy. It's something that we talk about with our international counterparts. As you'll know, there's quite a lot of different partnerships and forums at the moment. The policy that we've set out on the strategy is making sure that we have good ESG standards, and that we're doing that in partnership with countries to make sure that actually the mining that needs to take place works for them. So I would urge you to have a look at that. I do think it's one of the really key things that we need to make sure that we have access to in the coming decades.
Have we got time for one more? Claire's team.
Do you want to do a very quick one? I'll do shorter answers.
Okay.
Apologies.
Please, gentleman here. And then two. And then, yeah, please do really keep them. brief as
I
possible.
will do, I promise. Nick Johnson, BBC. Thank you, Secretary of State. The presumption was that you'd always close gas plants when they come to the end of their lives. So what's new in today's announcement? And also, the Prime Minister has spoken recently about MP safety. So why does your party and your government continue to support and defend Frank Hester following his comments about Diane Abbott? Thank you.
Minister, Paul McNamara, Channel 4 News. With regards to the new gas power stations, these are pretty dire warnings which you're responding to. But this is 14 years into being into power, having failed to deliver nuclear power plants. You've got a track record of U-turning on large-scale infrastructure like HS2, and a track record of shifting the goalposts on green policies like the banning of diesel cars. What faith can anyone in this room or voters at home have that you will actually deliver these power plants in a time fashion that, well, keeps the lights on?
Okay, so let me take that head on. We are the country that's added the most renewable capacity to our grid by one other country in Europe. So, you know, if you look at all of the stuff that we've built since we've been in power, it means that now almost half of our electricity comes from renewable energy. What we inherited from the previous Labour government was only 7% of our electricity coming from energy. I would say that that is actually a revolution and something that not many other countries have achieved. So that, I think, is a good example. In terms of nuclear, we are building nuclear. Again, we were not left a great legacy, and what you don't want in nuclear is a stop-start strategy, which is why the expansion plans that I set out cover multiple decades and set out a really long forward look so that people have the confidence to invest and to also make sure that we're building skills here. And just to come back to gas, that is the point that we're making today. We want to give investors confidence. This is something that we know that we need. Like I said, no one, virtually no one in the world is doing more than us when it comes to building renewables. But we know that underneath that, you need something when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And what we want to do is make sure that investors have confidence to build what we need in this country. Thank you very much.
Great.
I think I'm going to have to go.
You have to go now. Well, I'd just like, thank you very much indeed. If people could stay put in their seats while the Secretary of State leaves, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you.